Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that's been around longer than your great-great-grandmother's secret recipes, mescaline. Not the party drug version you might have heard whispered about at music festivals. I mean the real thing, the sacred cactus medicine that's been sending humans on cosmic journeys for at least 5,700 years, possibly longer than we've been baking bread. We're talking ancient ceremonies, scientific breakthroughs, hippie communes, and yes, eventually, tech billionaires microdosing in glass offices overlooking Silicon Valley. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. A huge thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. Your curiosity literally shaped tonight's journey, and I'm genuinely grateful. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Somehow, it's always 2 a.m. somewhere. Oh, and we're now live on Spotify. Links in the description if you want to take these stories on the go. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and let's pause for some questions. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to participate in a 3,000-year-old Aztec ceremony? Did ancient priests really communicate with gods, or were they just extremely high in very organized ways? What happens to your brain when you eat a cactus that tastes like Satan's armpit but supposedly reveals the secrets of the universe? Could you handle 8 hours of vomiting and visions just to gain spiritual insight? Would you trust a substance that's been illegal for decades but sacred for millennia? And now, congratulations! You've just been transported back to the mountains of what will one day be called Mexico, around 3700 BCE. You're holding a small, bitter cactus button. Someone's chanting. The stars look different, and you're about to understand why this plant has terrified governments and fascinated mystics for thousands of years. Good luck! Let's talk about where mescaline actually comes from, because it's not synthesized in a lab by someone wearing safety goggles and a questionable ponytail. It grows, slowly, painfully, slowly. We're talking about Lopophora williamsii, better known as peyote, a small, spineless cactus that looks like a deflated green button someone left in the desert and forgot about. Peyote doesn't grow in lush rainforests or convenient greenhouse conditions. No, it thrives in the absolute worst real estate nature has to offer, the Chihuahuan Desert, stretching across northern Mexico and into southern Texas. The soil is rocky, the rainfall is basically a suggestion, and summer temperatures regularly hit levels that would make Satan complain about the heat. And yet, there it is, this unassuming little cactus, growing about 1 millimeter per year like it has absolutely nowhere to be. The plant itself is remarkably unimpressive. It's small, rarely growing larger than a few inches in diameter. It has no spines, which in the cactus world is like showing up to a knife fight with a firmly worded letter. Its root system, however, is massive, a thick taproot that burrows deep into the earth, sometimes reaching down several feet to find water that may or may not actually exist. The cactus is essentially an optimist with a really good underground network. What makes peyote special isn't its appearance or its survival skills, it's what's inside. The cactus contains more than 50 different alkaloids, chemical compounds that interact with your brain in ways that range from mildly interesting to completely reality-shattering. The star of the show is mescaline, specifically 3,4,5-trimethoxyphenethylamine, which sounds like something you'd name a robot, not a molecule that makes you think you can communicate with hummingbirds. Mescaline works by binding to serotonin receptors in your brain, particularly the 5-HT2A receptor, which is essentially the brain's weird thoughts department. When mescaline shows up, it doesn't just knock on the door, it kicks it open, rearranges the furniture, and starts asking uncomfortable questions about the nature of consciousness and why you've been living your life wrong. But here's the catch. Peyote takes forever to grow. A cactus large enough to contain a meaningful amount of mescaline, what's called a button, takes between 10 to 30 years to reach maturity. That's right, the cactus you eat today started growing when people were still using dial-up internet, possibly before you were born, definitely before you made any good life decisions. Indigenous communities understood this. They harvested carefully, taking only the crown of the cactus and leaving the root intact so it could regenerate. It was sustainable, respectful, and slow, the exact opposite of how modern humans approach literally anything. You can't exactly order peyote on Amazon Prime and expect 2-day shipping. Well, you can try, but you'll probably end up on a watch list. The plant also has a defense mechanism that's less physical barrier and more psychological warfare. It tastes absolutely dreadful, which we'll get into later, but it's nature's way of saying, "Are you sure?" Like, really sure? Most animals take one bite and decide they'd rather starve. Humans, however, are the kind of species that sees a terrible idea and thinks, but what if we do it anyway? So there you have it. Mescaline comes from a small, slow-growing cactus that lives in a place where nothing should live, tastes like punishment, and takes decades to mature. It's the least convenient drug dealer in natural history, and yet, for thousands of years, humans have sought it out, cultivated it, protected it, and revered it as a doorway to the divine, which tells you everything you need to know about how powerful the experience must be. Somewhere, thousands of years ago, in the arid highlands of what's now northern Mexico, someone made a decision that would echo through millennia. They looked at a small, unpromising cactus growing among the rocks, and they ate it. Not because it looked delicious. It absolutely did not. Not because they were hungry, there were literally lizards nearby, but because something, whether curiosity, desperation, or divine whisper, told them to try. We'll never know their name. We'll never know if they were a shaman, a teenager on a dare, or someone who simply lost a bet. But we do know this. They ate that cactus, waited, and then experienced something that made them tell everyone they knew, and those people told others. And within generations, peyote wasn't just a weird plant, it was sacred. Archaeological evidence suggests humans have been using peyote for at least 5,700 years, possibly longer. Researchers have found ancient ceremonial sites in the Chihuahuan Desert containing preserved peyote buttons, ritual tools, and something that looks suspiciously like an altar. These weren't random campsites. They were pilgrimage destinations, places people traveled to specifically for the cactus and the visions it provided. Imagine being that first person. You chew the bitter, fibrous flesh, and it is bitter, aggressively so, the kind of taste that makes your whole face file a complaint. Your stomach immediately regrets every decision you've ever made. You feel nauseous, disoriented, possibly convinced you're dying. And then, somewhere between 30 minutes and 2 hours later, the world begins to shift. Colors intensify. Patterns emerge from nowhere, geometric, flowing, impossibly intricate. Sounds take on texture. Time becomes negotiable. And then come the visions. Entities, landscapes, ancestors, gods, or something your brain has no vocabulary for. You're still sitting in the desert, but you're also somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that feels older and truer than the physical world you left behind. For early humans, this wasn't recreation, it was revelation. In a world without written language, without scientific instruments, without any framework for understanding consciousness, this plant offered direct access to something beyond the ordinary. It was a telephone line to the divine, and all you had to do was survive the nausea. Early indigenous cultures didn't see peyote as a drug in the modern sense. They saw it as a teacher, a healer, a mediator between worlds. The plant wasn't used casually. It was reserved for ceremonies, for healing rituals, for moments when the community needed guidance from something greater than themselves. Eating peyote was a sacrament, not a Saturday night. Over centuries, these practices became formalized. Songs were composed to be sung during the visions. Rituals were developed to prepare the mind and body. Elders taught the young how to approach the plant with respect, how to interpret what they saw, and how to integrate the experience back into daily life. This wasn't about getting high, it was about getting answers. And the answers kept coming. Peyote guided hunters to game. It helped healers diagnose illness. It provided visions that shaped art, music, and spiritual beliefs. The cactus became woven into the fabric of existence for the cultures that used it, as essential as water or fire. So yes, somebody had to eat it first. And thank God they did, because that one brave, possibly foolish decision gave birth to one of humanity's oldest continuous spiritual practices. That first person didn't just trip, they opened a door that has remained open for nearly 6,000 years. They looked at a small, bitter cactus in the middle of nowhere and discovered that sometimes the universe hides its most profound truths in the least likely places. And honestly, that's the most human thing imaginable. Long before mescaline had a chemical name, long before anyone knew what an alkaloid was, the Huichol people of the Sierra Madre Mountains in Mexico had already perfected the art of the peyote pilgrimage. And when I say pilgrimage, I don't mean a casual road trip with snacks and a playlist. I mean a grueling 300-mile journey on foot through some of the most unforgiving terrain North America has to offer, undertaken not for Instagram content, but for spiritual survival. The Huichol, who call themselves the Wixárika, have been making this journey for over 1,000 years. Every year, a group of pilgrims led by a Mara Akame, a shaman priest who's earned the role through years of training, visions, and surviving things that would hospitalize most people, sets out from their mountain villages toward Wirikuta, the sacred desert where peyote grows. This isn't a vacation. Before the pilgrimage even begins, participants undergo ritual purification that includes fasting, sexual abstinence, and public confession of every transgression from the past year. Yes, every single one, in front of the entire group. Imagine airing all your dirty laundry before walking 300 miles. That's commitment. The journey itself is brutal. Pilgrims walk for weeks, often in extreme heat, carrying minimal supplies. They sleep on the ground, exposed to the elements. They sing sacred songs, recount myths, and maintain ritual protocols every step of the way. There are no shortcuts. There is no quitting. You walk until your feet bleed, and then you keep walking, because this journey isn't about your comfort. It's about connecting with your ancestors, with the gods, and with the land itself. When they finally reach Wirikuta, the pilgrims don't just grab peyote and head home. First, there's a ritual hunt. The peyote cactus is referred to as the deer, and finding it is treated like tracking sacred game. The Marakame leads the group, and when the first peyote is spotted, he shoots it with an arrow, symbolically of course, just as ancient hunters once brought down deer to feed their people. The cactus is harvested with prayers and offerings. Tobacco, candles, and sacred items are left behind as payment, as gratitude, as acknowledgement that this is a gift, not a commodity. The Huichol don't take more than they need. They cut the crown carefully, leaving the root intact so the plant can regenerate. It's conservation practiced as devotion. Once harvested, the peyote is consumed right there in the desert, and this is where the pilgrimage transforms into ceremony. The Huichol sit together, chewing the bitter buttons, singing, drumming, and waiting for the visions to begin. These aren't party drugs, these are prayers made chemical. The mescaline opens doorways, and through those doorways come messages from the gods, guidance for the community, healing for the sick, and renewal for the land. For the Huichol, peyote isn't a substance, it's a living being, a relative, a sacred link to their origins. Their entire cosmology is woven around the pilgrimage to Wirikuta. The journey connects the four sacred elements of Huichol life: deer, maize, peyote, and rain. Without this ceremony, the balance breaks. The rains don't come, the crops fail, and the ancestors grow silent. Even today, despite roads, cars, and modernity pressing in from all sides, Huichol pilgrims still make the journey. Some now drive part of the way, but many still walk, maintaining traditions that predate the Aztecs, the Spanish, and every empire that's tried to erase them. The Huichol aren't just users of peyote, they're its protectors, its interpreters, its living memory. They've kept the sacred hunt alive through conquest, colonization, prohibition, and indifference. And they're still walking, still singing, still honoring a cactus that has guided their people for over a millennium. That's not drug use. That's devotion. Here's something they don't put in the mystical guidebooks. Peyote tastes absolutely horrible. Not kinda weird horrible, not acquired taste horrible. We're talking your tongue is filing a formal complaint and considering early retirement horrible. Imagine chewing on a combination of battery acid, moldy leather, and the tears of disappointed ancestors, all wrapped in the texture of a sun-dried slug. The first thing you notice when you bite into a peyote button is the bitterness. Not the bitter of coffee or dark chocolate. This is a primal, aggressive bitterness that bypasses your taste buds and goes straight to your soul, demanding to know why you're doing this to yourself. It's the kind of taste that makes you wonder if the plant is actively trying to discourage you, which, spoiler alert, it is. Peyote's defense mechanism isn't thorns or poison. It's making itself so unpalatable that most creatures take one bite and decide they'd rather eat rocks. The taste comes from the alkaloids, the same compounds that produce the psychedelic effects. So yes, the thing that makes you see God also makes you want to die before you get there. It's a package deal, but the taste is just the opening act. Once you've forced yourself to chew and swallow, an act of will that rivals any extreme sport, your stomach enters the chat, and your stomach is not happy. Nausea hits fast and hard, a rolling, churning sensation that makes you question every life choice that led you to this moment. Some people vomit immediately. Others spend hours fighting the urge, convinced that if they can just hold it down, the visions will be worth it. Indigenous practitioners will tell you the nausea is part of the process. It's your body purging toxins, your ego fighting to stay in control, your spirit preparing for the journey ahead. Western scientists will tell you it's simply your digestive system reacting to foreign alkaloids it has no idea how to process. Either way, it's miserable. The texture doesn't help. Peyote buttons are fibrous, chewy, and dry, like eating a very angry piece of jerky that's been left in the sun for a decade. Your jaw gets tired, your teeth hurt, and the whole time that bitter, acrid taste just sits in your mouth, refusing to leave, even if you chase it with water, which doesn't help, or fruit, which makes it worse. Some people try to mitigate the horror by making peyote tea, boiling the buttons and straining out the solids. This does absolutely nothing to improve the taste. It just turns the experience into drinking hot, bitter swamp water that burns on the way down and haunts you on the way back up. Others grind dried buttons into powder and pack them into capsules, which delays the inevitable but doesn't prevent it. Eventually, your stomach figures out what you've done, and it will have its revenge. And here's the cruel irony. You can't just eat one button and call it a day. A meaningful ceremonial dose requires multiple buttons, sometimes 5 or 6, sometimes more depending on potency. So you're not just enduring the taste once, you're committing to it repeatedly, button after button, each one as bad as the last, while your body screams at you to stop. But people do it anyway. They have for thousands of years, because on the other side of the nausea, past the bitterness and the retching, something extraordinary waits. Colors that don't exist in normal vision, insights that reshape your understanding of reality, a sense of connection so profound it makes the suffering feel like a small price to pay. The Huchol say the plant tests you. It wants to know if you're serious, if you're worthy, if you can endure discomfort for the sake of truth. The taste isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's the universe asking, how badly do you want this? And if your answer is badly enough to eat another button, then maybe, just maybe, you're ready for what comes next. So yes, enlightenment requires a strong stomach, literally. By the time the Aztec Empire rose to power in central Mexico, mescaline wasn't just a plant, it was infrastructure. The Aztecs had transformed peyote and other sacred cacti into the backbone of their religious calendar, their medical system, and their understanding of reality itself. These weren't casual ceremonies where someone showed up late with chips. These were meticulously choreographed rituals that could last for days, involved hundreds of participants, and came with the kind of stakes that made missing a step genuinely dangerous. The Aztecs didn't call it mescaline, obviously. They called peyote peyotl, which roughly translates to divine messenger, or glisten, or cocoon of the caterpillar, depending on which linguistic scholar you ask and how much they've had to drink. They also used another mescaline-containing cactus called San Pedro, which they referred to in various ways, often linked to ceremonies that honored the gods of rain, sun, and warfare. Aztec priests weren't just religious leaders, they were chemists, astronomers, psychologists, and occasionally executioners, sometimes all in the same afternoon. They understood that peyote was powerful, unpredictable, and required respect. So they built entire systems around its use, complete with trained specialists, ritual protocols, and consequences for misuse that ranged from public shaming to very permanent solutions. Ceremonies typically began with fasting and purification. Participants would abstain from food, sex, and basically anything enjoyable for days beforehand. This wasn't punishment, it was preparation. You didn't walk into a peyote ceremony with a full stomach and a casual attitude. You arrived empty, focused, and aware that you were about to cross a threshold between the human world and something far less predictable. The setting mattered immensely. Ceremonies took place in sacred temples, often at night, surrounded by ritual objects that had been blessed and prepared. Copal incense burning, drums carved from hollowed logs, obsidian blades that caught firelight in ways that made them look alive. The atmosphere was designed to shift consciousness before the peyote even entered the picture. When the cactus was finally distributed, it wasn't handed out like party favors. Priests would chant specific invocations, asking the gods for permission, for protection, for insight. Participants consumed the buttons in a prescribed order, and then they waited. The Aztecs understood that mescaline doesn't hit you like alcohol. It builds slowly, creeping through your system until suddenly the world has different rules, and you're just expected to roll with it. What happened next varied depending on the purpose of the ceremony. Some rituals were for healing, where priests would enter visionary states to diagnose illness, communicate with a patient's spirit, and prescribe treatments that ranged from herbal remedies to full-on spiritual exorcisms. Other ceremonies were divinatory. Priests would consume peyote to receive messages from the gods about upcoming battles, harvests, or political decisions. The visions weren't suggestions, they were instructions. Music played a crucial role. Aztec ceremonies featured drums, rattles, flutes, and voices raised in song, not for entertainment, but to guide the journey. The rhythms were designed to sync with the heartbeat, to anchor participants when the visions became overwhelming, to create a sonic map through territory that had no landmarks. And then there were the darker ceremonies, the ones that make modern people uncomfortable. The Aztecs practiced ritual sacrifice, and peyote sometimes played a role in those rituals, not for the victim, but for the priests and participants. The visions helped them transcend the horror of what they were doing, framing it as necessary, as divine, as a cosmic transaction that kept the sun rising and the world turning. The Spanish, when they arrived, were horrified, not just by the sacrifice, but by the mere existence of a plant that allowed people to communicate with gods that weren't the Christian one. To Spanish priests, peyote was proof of demonic influence, a tool of Satan, something that had to be destroyed. But the Aztecs had already spent centuries weaving peyote into their civilization so deeply that removing it would be like trying to pull a thread from a tapestry without unraveling the whole thing. Spoiler alert, the Spanish tried anyway. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 1500s, armed with steel, smallpox, and an unshakable certainty that they were right about absolutely everything, they encountered something that terrified them more than Aztec warriors or unfamiliar diseases: indigenous people talking to their gods. And worse, those gods were answering back. The Spanish had a word for this: heresy. And they had a solution: violence. Hernán Cortés and his men arrived in 1519, and within 2 years they toppled the Aztec Empire through a combination of superior weaponry, strategic alliances with rival tribes, and diseases that killed faster than any army could. But conquering the land was the easy part. Conquering the spirit, that was a different war entirely, and peyote was right at the center of it. Spanish priests, particularly the Franciscans and Dominicans who followed the conquistadors, were tasked with converting the indigenous population to Catholicism. They built churches on top of temples, rewrote histories, and burned codices, ancient books that contained centuries of accumulated knowledge, astronomy, medicine, and ritual. They were very thorough in their cultural genocide. But then they encountered peyote, and they realized they had a problem. The plant wouldn't burn. I mean, you could physically set it on fire, but the practice wouldn't die. People kept using it. Secretly, quietly, defiantly. The Spanish could destroy temples, but they couldn't destroy every cactus in the desert. And they couldn't destroy the knowledge that had been passed down through generations, encoded in songs, stories, and ceremonies that didn't require written records to survive. The Spanish chroniclers wrote about peyote with a mixture of fascination and horror. Bernardino de Sahagún, a Franciscan friar who documented Aztec culture, described peyote users as people who saw visions either frightful or ludicrous. Another priest, José de Acosta, wrote that indigenous people used the plant to foresee and to predict things, and that they claimed to receive divine messages through it. To the Catholic Church, this was unacceptable. Prophecy was supposed to come through sanctioned channels, through priests, through saints, through the Bible, not through a cactus. So the Church did what the Church does best. It issued decrees. Peyote use was officially condemned as an act of superstition, idolatry, and communication with demons. Indigenous people caught using it could be punished with flogging, imprisonment, or forced labor. Repeat offenders faced worse. The message was clear: abandon your traditions, accept Jesus, and forget that peyote ever existed. But here's the thing about trying to erase a sacred practice that's been central to a culture for thousands of years: it doesn't work. What happens instead is adaptation, resistance, and a kind of spiritual guerrilla warfare that the Spanish, for all their military might, were completely unprepared for. Indigenous communities began hiding their ceremonies. They moved them to remote locations, to caves, to mountain villages where Spanish authorities rarely ventured. They timed them carefully, disguising them as Catholic festivals or conducting them at night when soldiers were asleep. They became masters of duality, attending Mass on Sunday and peyote ceremonies on Tuesday, keeping both worlds alive because abandoning either meant losing themselves completely. Some communities even began syncing peyote rituals with Catholic imagery, not out of genuine conversion but as camouflage. They'd place crosses near their ceremonial sites, invoke the Virgin Mary alongside indigenous deities, and call peyote the flesh of God, which technically aligned with Catholic communion but meant something entirely different to those who used it. The Spanish saw conversion. The indigenous saw survival. This wasn't surrender, it was strategy. And it worked. While the Spanish thought they'd won, that they'd successfully Christianized the New World, thousands of indigenous people were quietly maintaining their traditions underground, passing them from parent to child, elder to initiate, generation to generation. The conquest destroyed cities, killed millions, and shattered civilizations. But it didn't destroy peyote. The cactus survived because the people who needed it refused to let it die, even when refusing meant risking everything. And that refusal, that stubborn insistence on spiritual autonomy, became its own form of resistance, one that would outlast the Spanish Empire itself. The conquistadors won the land, but they never conquered the visions. The Catholic Church didn't just frown upon peyote use. They went after it with the kind of focused rage usually reserved for actual threats to civilization. The Spanish Inquisition, that delightful organization known for torture, forced conversions, and a complete absence of chill, declared peyote use an act of devil worship. Priests wrote furious letters back to Spain describing Indians who ate diabolical roots and claimed to see the future, heal the sick, or communicate with the dead. In 1620, the Inquisition issued an official edict condemning peyote. The document is remarkable in its paranoia and specificity. Ainji, it described the plant as a tool of Satan, designed to deceive Christians and lead souls to damnation. Using peyote, the Church declared, was proof of a pact with the devil, and the punishment for such a pact was severe: public penance if you were lucky, execution if you weren't. Inquisitors were dispatched across Mexico to root out peyote use, the way you'd root out an infection. They interrogated villagers, tortured confessions out of suspected users, and forced people to publicly renounce their traditions. These weren't private trials, they were spectacles designed to terrify entire communities into compliance. Confess, repent, and maybe you'd live. Refuse, and you'd become an example. The Church's argument was theological but also practical. They understood that peyote gave Indigenous people access to spiritual experiences that bypassed the Church entirely. You didn't need a priest to interpret God's will if you could eat a cactus and receive visions directly. This was deeply threatening to an institution that maintained power through its role as the sole intermediary between humanity and the divine. But the Inquisition faced a problem. Peyote use was too widespread, too decentralized, and too deeply embedded in Indigenous culture to stamp out completely. Unlike a single heretical priest who could be arrested and burned, or a forbidden book that could be seized and destroyed, peyote was a practice carried in the minds and hearts of thousands of people scattered across a massive, difficult-to-police territory. So the Inquisitors adapted. They created networks of informants, offering rewards to anyone who reported peyote use. They pressured Indigenous leaders to inform on their own communities. They forced converts to spy on their neighbors, turning villages into surveillance states where trust evaporated and fear reigned. And it worked. Sort of. Publicly, peyote use declined. Ceremonies became rarer, more secretive. People stopped talking about it openly. From the outside, it looked like the Church had won. But what the Inquisition didn't realize, or perhaps didn't care about, was that they were only driving the practice deeper underground. Ceremonies didn't stop, they just became invisible. Knowledge didn't disappear, it just stopped being written down, encoded instead in oral traditions that couldn't be seized or burned. Indigenous communities developed elaborate systems to protect their practices. Elders would teach the young in secret, often waiting years to ensure the initiate could be trusted. Ceremonies were held in remote locations, announced through coded language, and attended only by those who'd proven their loyalty. If inquisitors came asking questions, entire villages would claim ignorance, creating a wall of silence that no amount of torture could breach. The Inquisition also underestimated the role of mestizos, people of mixed Spanish and Indigenous heritage, who often served as bridges between worlds. Some publicly denounced peyote while privately facilitating its use. Others outwardly embraced Catholicism while maintaining Indigenous spiritual practices in secret, living doubled lives that required constant vigilance and performance. There are records of trials that reveal just how brutal this period was. In one case from 1650, a woman named Maria was accused of being a peyote curandera, a healer who used the cactus to diagnose and treat illness. She was arrested, interrogated, and tortured until she confessed not just to using peyote, but to consorting with demons. Her confession was likely forced, her guilt assumed before the trial even began. The records don't say what happened to her after, which usually means the outcome wasn't something the Church wanted documented. And yet, despite the Inquisition's efforts, despite the torture and the fear and the public burnings, peyote survived. Not because it was invincible, but because the people who used it were more committed to preserving it than the Church was to destroying it. The Inquisition's war on visions lasted for centuries, and it failed. Not immediately, not obviously, but definitively. By the time the Inquisition lost its power in the early 1800s, peyote was still there, still sacred, still being passed down through generations who refused to forget. The Church could burn people, but it couldn't burn memory. So, what happens when you tell an entire culture that their most sacred practice is now punishable by death, torture, or forced labor? If you're the Spanish Inquisition, you probably expect compliance, fear, maybe some groveling. What you get instead is something far more dangerous: resilience. For the next 400 years, Indigenous communities across Mexico and the American Southwest did something extraordinary. They kept the ceremonies alive. This wasn't passive resistance. This was active, intentional, and incredibly dangerous preservation. Every ceremony held in secret was an act of defiance. Every elder who taught the songs was risking their life. Every person who participated knew they could be arrested, beaten, or killed if discovered, and they did it anyway. The methods of concealment were ingenious. Ceremonies were held in caves, far from colonial settlements, in places so remote that Spanish soldiers would never bother making the journey. Participants traveled separately, arriving at different times to avoid suspicion. They used coded language, referring to peyote as medicine or the plant rather than its real name. Outsiders were never invited. Trust had to be earned over years, sometimes decades. Timing was everything. Ceremonies were scheduled around Catholic holidays, not out of reverence for the church, but because those were the days when Spanish authorities were distracted, drunk, or too busy with their own celebrations to notice what indigenous people were doing. Easter, Christmas, saints' feast days all became cover for peyote rituals that predated Christianity by millennia. The oral tradition became the backbone of survival. Everything that mattered, the songs, the prayers, the rituals, the proper way to harvest and prepare peyote, was memorized and passed down verbally. Nothing was written down because written records could be seized, used as evidence, turned into death sentences. Knowledge lived in the minds of the people, transmitted through careful teaching, through apprenticeship, through initiation. Elders became the guardians of this knowledge, and their role was sacred. They didn't just lead ceremonies, they were living libraries, carrying centuries of accumulated wisdom in their memories. If an elder died without passing on their knowledge, entire pieces of the tradition could be lost forever. So training the next generation became a community priority, a spiritual duty, a form of resistance that masqueraded as simple storytelling. Children were taught in layers. First, they learned the songs, which seemed innocent enough, just old melodies passed down through families. Then they learned the stories, myths, and legends that contained encoded knowledge about plants, healing, and the spiritual world. Only later, once trust was established, once maturity was proven, would they be taught the deeper meanings, the rituals, the sacred use of peyote itself. Women played a crucial role, often overlooked by Spanish authorities who assumed spiritual leadership was exclusively male. Female curanderas, healers, maintained their own lineages of knowledge, their own ceremonies, their own ways of working with the plant. They healed in secret, taught in whispers, and passed their practices to daughters and apprentices who would carry them forward. The Spanish, meanwhile, congratulated themselves on their successful Christianization. They saw indigenous people attending Mass, baptizing their children, and seemingly abandoning the old ways. What they didn't see was the double life being lived, Catholic by day, indigenous by night. People carried rosaries and peyote buttons. They prayed to saints and ancient gods. They attended confession and then went to ceremonies where forgiveness came from the earth itself. This duality created its own unique forms of syncretism, the blending of traditions. Some communities genuinely merged Catholic and indigenous practices, not as surrender but as innovation. Peyote became the flesh of Christ in a very different sense than the Church intended. The Virgin Mary was honored alongside indigenous goddesses. Crosses appeared at ceremonial sites, but they pointed to the four directions, not just to heaven. For 400 years, this underground network persisted. Grandparents taught grandchildren, villages protected their own, knowledge was guarded fiercely but passed on faithfully. And through it all, peyote remained, hidden, sacred, and unbroken. By the time the Spanish Empire collapsed in the early 1800s, by the time Mexico gained independence and the Inquisition's power finally crumbled, peyote was still there. Battered, scattered, driven to the margins, but alive. The ceremonies had survived not because they were easy to hide, but because people decided they were worth dying for. That's not just cultural preservation, that's spiritual warfare, fought quietly and won slowly. And the fact that you can still participate in a Huichol peyote ceremony today, that the songs are still being sung, that the traditions remain intact, that's the victory. 4 centuries of oppression tried to erase it, and it refused to be erased. By the mid-1800s, as the United States was busy expanding westward, shooting buffalo, and displacing anyone inconvenient, peyote quietly crossed what would become the US-Mexico border. It didn't arrive with fanfare or diplomatic approval. It came in the hands, hearts, and visions of Native American communities who had been stripped of land, language, and autonomy, but refused to surrender their spiritual practices. The story of how peyote entered the United States is messy, decentralized, and tied directly to one of the darkest chapters in American history, the systematic destruction of Native American culture. By the 1870s, most tribes had been forcibly relocated to reservations, confined to small parcels of land that were usually the worst real estate available. Traditional ways of life, hunting, gathering, seasonal migration, were impossible. Children were being kidnapped and sent to boarding schools designed to kill the Indian, save the man. Native languages were forbidden. Ceremonies were banned. The US government was actively trying to erase indigenous culture from existence. Into this devastation came peyote. It spread northward through trade routes, intertribal communication, and word of mouth. Lipan, Apache, Comanche, and Kiowa communities in Texas and Oklahoma were among the first to adopt it, learning about the plant from Mexican tribes who had been using it for centuries. To these communities, peyote wasn't a new drug, it was a lifeline, a way to reconnect with the sacred in a world that had been violently desecrated. But American authorities saw it differently. Indian agents, missionaries, and government officials viewed peyote as a dangerous intoxicant, a barrier to assimilation, and evidence that Native Americans were still savage and needed further control. Reports began filtering back to Washington describing wild ceremonies, all-night rituals, and indigenous people claiming to communicate with spirits through a cactus. The reaction was predictable: alarm, condemnation, and calls for prohibition. What made peyote particularly threatening to authorities was that it gave Native Americans something they weren't supposed to have: spiritual autonomy. The U.S. government's assimilation strategy relied on replacing indigenous religions with Christianity, specifically the kind of Christianity that taught obedience, individualism, and acceptance of the status quo. Peyote offered the opposite: a communal, vision-based spirituality that didn't require white intermediaries and didn't preach submission. By the 1880s, peyote ceremonies were spreading rapidly across reservations. Different tribes adapted the practice to fit their own traditions, creating diverse forms of peyote religion. The Kiowa and Comanche developed what would become known as the half-moon ceremony, held in tipis, featuring all-night singing, drumming, and prayer. The Navajo integrated peyote into their own healing traditions. The Lakota Sioux brought it into their spiritual practices, blending it with elements of the ghost dance movement, a messianic revival that promised the return of the buffalo and the restoration of native lands. This terrified American authorities. They'd just finished suppressing the ghost dance movement in 1890, culminating in the Wounded Knee Massacre, where US troops killed hundreds of Lakota men, women, and children. The last thing they wanted was another pan-tribal spiritual movement, especially one that made people feel empowered, connected, and less interested in assimilating. Indian agents began pressuring tribal leaders to ban peyote. Missionaries preached against it, calling it the devil's work. Some reservations enacted local prohibitions, but enforcement was difficult because ceremonies were held in private, often at night, and participants weren't about to report each other to authorities who'd already taken everything else. Meanwhile, anthropologists and curious outsiders began taking notice. James Mooney, an ethnographer with the Bureau of American Ethnology, conducted some of the first serious studies of peyote use among Native Americans in the 1890s. Unlike most white observers, Mooney actually participated in ceremonies, took peyote himself, and concluded that it was a legitimate religious practice, not a dangerous drug. His reports were met with skepticism by officials who preferred simpler narratives about savage intoxication. By 1900, peyote had established itself firmly in Native American communities across the Southwest and Great Plains. It had crossed the border not as an invasion, but as an adaptation, a spiritual practice that indigenous people embraced because it offered what the U.S. government had tried to destroy: connection, meaning, healing, and hope. The cactus had arrived in America, and now the real fight was about to begin, a legal, political, and spiritual battle over who had the right to control consciousness, to define religion, and to decide what Native Americans were allowed to believe. That battle would rage for the next century and, in many ways, is still being fought today. In the late 19th century, something remarkable happened. Indigenous communities across North America, facing cultural genocide, forced assimilation, and the collapse of traditional ways of life, found a way to fight back spiritually. They created the Native American Church, a syncretic religious movement that blended Christianity with peyote ceremonies. And before you ask, yes, it was controversial. And no, they didn't care. The formation of the Native American Church wasn't a single event. It was a gradual coalescence of practices, beliefs, and legal strategies developed by various tribes over several decades. But the key figure in its formal organization was Quanah Parker, a Comanche chief who was half white. His mother, Cynthia Ann Parker, had been kidnapped as a child and raised Comanche and fully committed to protecting peyote traditions. Quanah Parker had tried peyote in the 1880s after suffering from an illness that white doctors couldn't cure. According to his own account, a Mexican curandera gave him peyote, he had visions, and he recovered. Whether the healing was chemical, spiritual, or placebo didn't matter to him. It worked. And he became one of peyote's most vocal advocates, defending it not as a drug, but as a sacrament, something sacred and protected by religious freedom. The genius of the Native American Church was that it reframed peyote in terms white Americans could theoretically understand. Instead of presenting it as an alien, indigenous practice that threatened Christian values, church leaders positioned it as compatible with Christianity. Jesus appeared in visions. The Bible was read during ceremonies. Peyote was called the flesh of Christ, a direct parallel to communion. They weren't rejecting Christianity, they were adapting it. This wasn't cynical, it was strategic. Native American communities had been forcibly Christianized for generations. Many genuinely believed in Jesus, the Bible, and Christian morality. But they also believed in their own traditions, in the visions peyote provided, in the healing ceremonies that predated European contact. The Native American Church allowed them to hold both truths simultaneously without betraying either. Ceremonies in the Native American Church followed a specific structure that varied slightly by tribe but shared common elements. Participants gathered in a teepee around a crescent-shaped altar made of earth. A fire burned in the center all night. The roadman, the ceremony's leader, guided participants through prayers, songs, and the ritual consumption of peyote. Drums, eagle-bone whistles, and gourd rattles provided rhythm. Water was blessed and shared. And between the singing and the visions, people prayed for healing, for guidance, for strength to survive in a world that wanted them erased. These weren't wild, uncontrolled drug parties. They were deeply structured religious services that required preparation, respect, and intention. Participants fasted beforehand. They confessed wrongs. They approached the ceremony with reverence. The goal wasn't to get high. It was to pray harder, to see clearer, to connect with something greater than themselves. But non-native authorities didn't see it that way. To them, peyote was an intoxicant, and no amount of Jesus talk could change that. Beginning in the early 1900s, states started passing laws banning peyote. Colorado prohibited it in 1917. Nevada followed in 1923. By the 1930s, more than a dozen states had criminalized peyote possession and use, even for religious purposes. The Native American Church fought back legally. They argued that peyote use was protected under the First Amendment's guarantee of religious freedom. They testified before Congress, produced affidavits from members who credited peyote with curing alcoholism and healing illness, and emphasized that their ceremonies promoted morality, family values, and sobriety, everything mainstream America claimed to want. It was a hard sell. The US had spent decades trying to destroy Native American religions, and now Indigenous people were asking for legal protection to practice a new one that involved eating a psychoactive cactus. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, but the Native American Church persisted. By the 1940s, membership had grown to include dozens of tribes. The church became not just a religious institution but a political force, a way for Indigenous people to organize, assert their rights, and demand recognition. It was one of the few pan-tribal movements that successfully united communities across vast geographical and cultural differences. The legal battles continued for decades, losses, victories, and everything in between. But the Native American Church survived. It formalized, expanded, and became a permanent fixture in Native American life. Today, it has hundreds of thousands of members and remains one of the most significant expressions of Indigenous spirituality in North America. They didn't just mix Jesus and cactus, they created something new, something resilient, something that couldn't be killed because it drew strength from two worlds and belonged fully to neither. And in doing so, they protected peyote, preserved traditions, and proved that spiritual resistance is its own form of sovereignty. By the 1890s, word of peyote had reached the scientific community, which meant it was only a matter of time before someone in a lab coat decided to isolate, name, and probably ruin it. Enter European and American chemists, armed with beakers, notebooks, and the unshakable belief that if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. In 1897, German chemist Arthur Hefter became the first person to isolate mescaline from peyote. Hefter wasn't a spiritual seeker. He wasn't interested in ancient wisdom or indigenous practices. He was a pharmacologist trying to figure out which specific chemical in peyote caused the visions. So he did what scientists do. He ground up peyote buttons, extracted various alkaloids, and then, because this was the 1890s and ethical oversight was more of a suggestion than a requirement, he tested them on himself. One by one, Hefter ingested different compounds isolated from peyote. Some did nothing. Some made him feel vaguely unwell. And then he tried the fourth alkaloid he'd isolated, which he labeled alkaloid number 4. Within an hour, he was seeing geometric patterns, experiencing altered perception of time, and generally having the kind of experience that makes you question whether becoming a chemist was a good life choice. He'd found it, the compound responsible for peyote's visionary effects. He named it mescaline, after the Mescalero Apache, though the naming was somewhat arbitrary. Other tribes had been using peyote far longer, but Western science has never been great at giving credit where it's due. Once mescaline was isolated, other scientists got involved. In 1919, Ernst Speth, an Austrian chemist, successfully synthesized mescaline in a laboratory for the first time. This was huge. It meant you could produce the compound without the cactus, without the bitterness, without waiting decades for plants to grow. You could make it in bulk, study it systematically, and potentially use it as medicine. The scientific community became fascinated. Here was a substance that could reliably alter consciousness, produce visual hallucinations, and create mystical experiences, and it did so in predictable, dose-dependent ways. Researchers began studying how it worked in the brain, how it affected perception, how it compared to other known substances. But the scientists approached mescaline with a very different lens than indigenous practitioners. Where the Huicol saw a sacred teacher, scientists saw a research tool. Where ceremonies emphasized context, intention, and spiritual preparation, laboratory studies emphasized controlled conditions, isolated variables, and objective measurement. The substance was the same, but the framework was completely different. Some researchers did try to bridge the gap. Louis Lewin, a German toxicologist, published one of the first comprehensive studies of peyote in 1888, and he at least acknowledged the plant's cultural significance. He interviewed indigenous users, documented traditional uses, and tried to understand the experience on its own terms before reducing it to chemistry. But he was the exception. Most Western scientists treated mescaline as just another interesting compound, stripped of context and meaning. They measured pupil dilation, reaction times, and color perception changes. They noted that subjects experienced synesthesia, hearing colors, seeing sounds, and documented the geometric patterns that appeared in the visual field. They observed that mescaline produced a state of heightened awareness without significant cognitive impairment, which made it different from alcohol or opiates. But what they couldn't measure, they often dismissed. The spiritual insights, the sense of cosmic unity, the feeling that the universe was trying to communicate something important, these were classified as subjective effects and largely ignored. Science wanted data, not mysticism. Still, a few brave souls ventured into the subjective territory. Silas Weir Mitchell, an American neurologist, took mescaline in 1896 and wrote a detailed account of his experience. He described seeing wonderful, phantasmagoric changes and colors so vivid they seemed to have a living, palpitating quality. He saw jewels, architectural structures, and landscapes that couldn't possibly exist. And he concluded that mescaline offered a window into altered states of consciousness that could help researchers understand perception, memory, and the nature of reality itself. But Mitchell also noted something important. The experience was overwhelming, often unpleasant, and not something he'd want to repeat casually. The nausea was brutal. The intensity was difficult to manage. And without cultural context or spiritual framework, the visions felt random, even threatening. He'd accessed the same chemical doorway indigenous people had used for millennia, but he'd walked through it alone, without songs, without guidance, without the collective understanding that made the experience meaningful rather than merely strange. This became a recurring theme in Western scientific engagement with mescaline: fascination without comprehension. Scientists could describe what happened in the brain, receptor binding, neurotransmitter activity, neural pathway activation, but they struggled to explain why the experience felt significant, why people returned to it, why cultures built entire cosmologies around it. The arrival of scientists transformed mescaline from a sacred plant medicine into a research chemical. That shift brought knowledge, but it also brought disconnection. The cactus that had been revered as a living teacher was now a source of extract, quantifiable and controllable. And while that opened new doors, it also closed others, particularly the door that led back to understanding why indigenous people had called it sacred in the first place. In 1897, British psychologist Havelock Ellis did something that would define psychedelic literature for the next century. He ate peyote, had an absolutely wild time, and then wrote about it in exquisite, almost embarrassing detail. Ellis wasn't a mystic or a spiritual seeker. He was a sexologist, a researcher, and a man deeply curious about human consciousness. So naturally, when he heard about a cactus that could make you see geometric patterns and feel cosmic unity, he thought, yes, this seems scientifically important. I should eat it. Ellis obtained peyote buttons through a colleague and prepared for the experiment with the kind of Victorian thoroughness that makes modern researchers look reckless by comparison. He documented his baseline state, noted the time, and consumed 3 buttons, a moderate dose. Then he waited, pen in hand, ready to record whatever happened next. What happened next was that all hell broke loose, visually speaking. Ellis experienced what would later become recognized as the classic mescaline trajectory: initial nausea, followed by a gradual intensification of visual perception, and then full-blown hallucinations that transformed his study into an alien landscape of impossible beauty. He described seeing an immense field of golden jewels, studded with red and green stones, ever-changing. The walls breathed. Colors became entities unto themselves, pulsing and alive. Patterns emerged from nowhere, intricate, geometric, more complex than anything he could have imagined or designed. He saw architectural structures that seemed Moorish or Byzantine, except they were built from light and impossible angles. But Ellis was also a scientist, and even as his visual cortex staged a coup, he tried to maintain observational detachment. He noted that the hallucinations were most intense with his eyes closed. He observed that sounds seemed to have texture and color, synesthesia in action. He documented that his sense of time became elastic, minutes stretching into hours, hours compressing into moments. The experience lasted about 8 hours, and throughout it, Ellis maintained what he called intellectual clarity. He wasn't confused or delusional. He knew the visions weren't real. He could still think, reason, and analyze. But the visions were so beautiful, so intricate, so utterly beyond his normal perception that they felt more real than reality, more true than the mundane world he usually inhabited. When it was over, Ellis did what any good researcher would do. He wrote it up. His report, published in 1898 in the journal The Contemporary Review, was titled Mescal, A New Artificial Paradise. It was detailed, eloquent, and remarkably honest about both the wonder and the discomfort of the experience. Ellis compared mescaline to hashish and ether, other substances known to alter consciousness, but concluded that mescaline was unique. The visual effects were far more pronounced. The clarity of mind was unusual. You could observe your own hallucinations as they happened. And unlike alcohol or opiates, mescaline didn't dull the mind. It sharpened perception while simultaneously making that perception completely alien. His report did something revolutionary. It legitimized the subjective experience as worthy of scientific attention. Ellis argued that studying altered states of consciousness wasn't frivolous or dangerous. It was essential to understanding how the brain constructs reality. If a plant could so radically change perception without destroying cognitive function, what did that say about the nature of consciousness itself? Other intellectuals took notice. Writers, artists, and philosophers began experimenting with mescaline, and many published their own accounts. Suddenly, there was a genre, the trip report, a first-person narrative documenting altered states of consciousness with as much detail and honesty as possible. But Ellis also noted something that would become a recurring theme in psychedelic literature. The experience was almost impossible to fully communicate. Language, he wrote, was inadequate. The colors he saw didn't have names. The patterns defied description. The feelings of awe, terror, and beauty came in waves that couldn't be captured in words. You could describe the experience, but you couldn't convey it, not really. This limitation frustrated him. Ellis wanted to share what he'd seen, to convince others that this wasn't mere hallucination but a glimpse into a different mode of perception, a different way of experiencing reality. But he also acknowledged that anyone reading his report would only understand it partially unless they took mescaline themselves. And that's exactly what happened. Ellis's report became an instruction manual for curious intellectuals across Europe and America. Artists wanted to see if mescaline could enhance creativity. Philosophers wondered if it could provide insight into the nature of consciousness. Psychiatrists speculated that it might model mental illness, offering a window into conditions like schizophrenia. Havelock Ellis didn't just take mescaline, he turned it into literature, into science, into a cultural phenomenon. He gave the experience language, context, and legitimacy. And in doing so, he opened the door for a century of exploration, research, and debate about what it means to alter consciousness, and whether doing so can teach us something true about ourselves and the universe we inhabit. The first trip report had been written, and people were taking notes. If Havelock Ellis was mescaline's first travel blogger, Aldous Huxley was its poet laureate. In 1953, the British author and intellectual, already famous for writing Brave New World, a dystopian novel about control, pleasure, and dehumanization, decided to try mescaline under clinical supervision. What happened next wasn't just a trip. It was a philosophical earthquake that would reshape how Western culture thought about consciousness, art, and reality itself. Huxley was 59 years old, nearly blind, and fascinated by mysticism, Eastern philosophy, and the possibility that human perception was far more limited than we realized. He'd read accounts of mescaline experiences, including Ellis's, and become convinced that the substance might offer access to what he called mind at large, a vast, cosmic consciousness normally filtered out by the brain's utilitarian focus on survival. On a spring morning in Los Angeles, under the supervision of psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond, Huxley dissolved 400 milligrams of mescaline sulfate in water and drank it. Then he sat back and waited for the doors of perception to open. which is not just a poetic phrase but the title of the book he'd later write about the experience. What struck Huxley first wasn't the hallucinations, it was the intensification of everything. Colours became almost unbearably vivid. A simple vase of flowers transformed into something approaching the divine, each petal radiating significance, each fold of light and shadow revealing depths of meaning that normal perception simply couldn't access. He stared at the fabric of his trousers and saw entire universes in the weave. Huxley experienced what mystics had described for centuries: a dissolution of the ego, a sense of unity with everything, and the overwhelming feeling that this altered state, was more real than ordinary consciousness. The illusion, he realized, wasn't the mescaline vision. It was the narrow, utilitarian perception we mistake for reality the rest of the time. He wandered his garden, accompanied by Osmond and his wife Maria, narrating his experience as it unfolded. He looked at a chair and understood, in a way that went beyond words, the chairness of the chair, the pure essence of what made it exist. He saw paintings by Botticelli and Vermeer, and wept because he finally understood what the artists had been trying to convey. He was experiencing, he claimed, what William Blake had described, seeing a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower. But Huxley wasn't just having a mystical experience, he was analysing it in real time, because that's what intellectuals do, even when the universe is melting. He theorised that the brain normally acts as a reducing valve, filtering out the vast majority of sensory information to keep us focused on practical survival. Mescaline, he argued, temporarily opened that valve, allowing in a flood of perception that the brain usually suppresses. This wasn't a new idea. Philosophers and mystics had proposed similar concepts for centuries, but Huxley presented it in terms that resonated with modern, secular audiences. You didn't need to believe in God or subscribe to any particular religious framework to accept that consciousness might be far broader than what we normally access. Mescaline was proof. In 1954, Huxley published The Doors of Perception, a slim book that became one of the most influential texts of the psychedelic movement. It was philosophical, literary, and deeply personal. He argued that mescaline could offer artists, mystics, and seekers a glimpse of what consciousness could be if it weren't constantly narrowed by the brain's survival-oriented filtering. But he also acknowledged the dangers. Not everyone had a positive experience. Some people encountered terror, paranoia, or psychological chaos. Huxley warned that set and setting, mindset and environment were crucial. Take mescaline in the wrong context, with the wrong intentions, and you might not open the doors of perception, you might fall through the floor. The book was controversial. Psychiatrists worried it would encourage drug use. Religious leaders accused Huxley of promoting false enlightenment, but artists, writers, and young intellectuals devoured it. Here was a respected thinker, not some bohemian dropout, arguing that psychedelics could be tools for expanding consciousness, for accessing truths that ordinary perception concealed. Huxley followed up with Heaven and Hell in 1956, exploring the darker side of visionary experiences and the thin line between ecstasy and horror. He argued that the landscapes of heaven and hell described by mystics, artists, and religious visionaries across cultures were all variations of the same altered states that mescaline could produce. The visions weren't invented, they were accessed, regions of consciousness that existed whether we visited them or not. His work didn't just influence the psychedelic movement, it gave it intellectual legitimacy. When the Beatles, Jim Morrison, and countless others began experimenting with psychedelics in the 1960s, they were walking through doors that Huxley had not only opened, but also mapped, analysed, and described with the precision of a philosopher and the wonder of a mystic. Aldous Huxley took mescaline and returned with a message: the world we see is not the world that is. Our brains filter, reduce, and simplify reality into something manageable, but that filtered version is a shadow of what's actually there. Mescaline lifts the veil, and what you see might be terrifying or transcendent, but it will be true in a way that ordinary perception never is. He made mescaline literary, and in doing so, he made it matter. The 1950s, a time of suburban lawns, nuclear families, and secret government programs testing mind-altering substances on unsuspecting citizens. Because apparently, when you're the CIA and you've just watched the Soviets develop nuclear weapons, the logical next step is to ask, but can we control people's thoughts with drugs? Enter Project MKUltra, one of the most infamous and genuinely insane covert operations in American history. Let's set the stage. It's the early Cold War. The United States is convinced that the Soviets and Chinese have developed sophisticated brainwashing techniques capable of turning American soldiers into programmed agents. Evidence for this belief was thin, mostly confessions from POWs during the Korean War, who later recanted. But paranoia doesn't require evidence, just imagination and a budget. The CIA decided it needed its own mind control program, and in 1953 they launched MKUltra under the direction of Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist who resembled a mild-mannered librarian but thought like a Bond villain. The program's goal was ambitious: find substances and techniques that could manipulate memory, induce confessions, create amnesia, and potentially program human behavior. Mescaline was one of the first substances tested. The CIA was particularly interested because it produced powerful psychological effects without incapacitating the user. Unlike sedatives or truth serums that rendered people unconscious or incoherent, mescaline altered perception while leaving cognitive function relatively intact. Could it make someone more suggestible? Could it break down psychological defenses? Could it be weaponized? So they tested it, on volunteers sometimes, on unwitting subjects often. CIA operatives dosed each other as pranks. They slipped mescaline into drinks at office parties to observe the effects. They paid prostitutes to administer it to unsuspecting Johns in CIA-funded safe houses rigged with recording equipment and two-way mirrors. Yes, really. Your tax dollars at work. The experiments were as unscientific as they were unethical. There were no control groups, no consistent protocols, no informed consent. Researchers just dosed people and watched what happened, taking notes like they were observing lab rats rather than human beings who might, have thoughts about being secretly drugged by their own government. Some subjects had horrific experiences. Dr. Frank Olson, a CIA biochemist, was given LSD, another MKUltra favorite, without his knowledge in 1953. Days later, suffering from paranoia and psychological distress, he either jumped or was pushed from a hotel window. His death was ruled a suicide, but decades later, evidence suggested something darker. The CIA covered it up, paid his family a settlement, and kept experimenting. But the CIA wasn't just interested in mescaline for interrogation. They also explored its potential as a tool for psychological warfare. Could you dose an entire city's water supply and create mass chaos? Could you spike a foreign leader's food and make them appear insane during a televised speech? Could you create hallucinogenic aerosols to disorient enemy soldiers? They tried. None of it worked particularly well. Turns out, controlling human consciousness is significantly more complicated than Cold War paranoia assumed. Mescaline and other psychedelics didn't make people more suggestible or compliant. They often made them less so, more introspective, more questioning, more likely to have existential crises than follow orders. But MKUltra didn't stop. The program expanded to include over 80 institutions, universities, hospitals, prisons, most of which had no idea they were working for the CIA. Researchers were given grants to study psychedelics without being told the funding came from a covert mind control program. Prisoners were dosed repeatedly for weeks. Psychiatric patients were experimented on without consent. The program was so secretive that even most CIA employees didn't know about it. Documents were classified, experiments were hidden behind front organizations. And when the program was finally exposed in the 1970s, the CIA destroyed most of the records, burning documents and shredding evidence to avoid accountability. What survived was horrifying enough: evidence of systematic abuse, ethical violations, and experiments that would make Josef Mengele nod in approval. MK tested LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, barbiturates, amphetamines, and countless other substances on thousands of people, many of whom never knew what was done to them. The program didn't produce the mind control techniques the CIA hoped for. Instead, it traumatized countless people, violated basic human rights, and contributed to the eventual criminalization of psychedelics by associating them with government conspiracy and abuse, rather than healing or spirituality. Mescaline, which indigenous people had used sacredly for thousands of years, which scientists had studied carefully, which intellectuals like Huxley had approached with respect, the CIA turned it into a tool for covert warfare and human experimentation. And when the experiments failed to produce useful results, the CIA classified everything and moved on, leaving behind a legacy of paranoia, trauma, and justifiable distrust of government institutions. So yes, the 1950s were when the CIA got involved, and like most things the CIA touches, it made everything worse. By the early 1960s, mescaline had slipped out of the labs, the reservations, and the private salons of intellectuals and landed directly into the hands of a generation that was about to lose its mind, in the best and worst ways possible. The 1960s weren't just a decade, they were a full-scale cultural meltdown fueled by war, civil rights, rock and roll, and a sudden, widespread belief that reality was negotiable. Young people, especially college students and urban bohemians, had grown disillusioned with the sterile conformity of 1950s America. Suburbia felt like a prison. Corporate jobs felt meaningless. The Vietnam War felt like murder. And then along came psychedelics, LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, offering a radical alternative. What if the problem isn't you, but the way you've been taught to see the world? Mescaline became part of the psychedelic cocktail, though it was often overshadowed by LSD, which was cheaper, easier to produce, and stronger per dose. But mescaline had cachet. It was older, more rooted in tradition, more authentic than the synthetic upstart LSD. Taking mescaline meant connecting with indigenous wisdom, with ancient practices, with something deeper than just chemistry. Of course, most people taking mescaline in the 1960s had no connection to indigenous traditions whatsoever. They were white college kids reading Carlos Castaneda, listening to The Doors, and eating questionable pills sold as mescaline that were often just LSD or amphetamines mixed with strychnine. Actual mescaline requires extracting the compound from peyote or synthesizing it in a lab, both of which are time-consuming and difficult. So dealers just lied, and buyers didn't know the difference. Still, the real stuff circulated, and those who found it described experiences that were distinct from LSD. Mescaline's visionary quality felt more organic, more connected to nature. The body load was heavier, more nausea, more physical discomfort, but the visions felt earthier, less electric than LSD. Where LSD could feel like a rocket ship to another dimension, mescaline felt like a slow walk through a desert that kept revealing hidden depths. The counterculture embraced mescaline as part of a larger project, consciousness expansion. The idea was that Western society had conditioned people into narrow, ego-driven, materialistic ways of thinking, and psychedelics could break that conditioning, revealing deeper truths about self, society, and the universe. Timothy Leary, a psychologist turned psychedelic evangelist, famously urged people to turn on, tune in, drop out. Artists and musicians integrated mescaline into their creative processes. The Doors took their name from Huxley's The Doors of Perception. Jim Morrison, the band's lead singer, openly referenced mescaline and peyote in interviews, describing them as tools for accessing primal, shamanic consciousness. The Beatles, the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, entire genres of rock music were shaped by psychedelic experiences, and mescaline was part of that soundtrack. But not everyone was celebrating. Parents were terrified. Authorities were alarmed. The media ran sensational stories about teenagers jumping out of windows, going insane, or joining cults. Most of these stories were exaggerated or fabricated, but they fed a moral panic that would eventually lead to prohibition. The problem was that the psychedelic movement became too visible, too loud, too threatening to the status quo. What started as a philosophical exploration of consciousness morphed into a political statement. Taking psychedelics became an act of rebellion against the government, against capitalism, against the Vietnam War, against everything the establishment represented. And the establishment fought back. In 1965, Congress began holding hearings on LSD. Mescaline was swept up in the same panic, lumped together with LSD, psilocybin, and cannabis as dangerous drugs that were corrupting youth and destabilizing society. It didn't matter that mescaline had been used sacredly for thousands of years, or that research showed it had therapeutic potential. What mattered was that hippies were using it, and hippies were the enemy. By 1970, mescaline was classified as a Schedule I substance under the Controlled Substances Act, defined as having no accepted medical use and high potential for abuse. The same plant that had guided Indigenous ceremonies, inspired great literature, and opened the doors of perception was now illegal, punishable by prison time, and associated not with healing or spirituality but with crime and degeneracy. The psychedelic 60s had turned mescaline mainstream, but in doing so, they'd also guaranteed its prohibition. The cactus that had survived Spanish conquest, Catholic Inquisition, and centuries of suppression couldn't survive becoming a symbol of youth rebellion in Cold War America. The party was over. The doors were closing. And for the next few decades, mescaline would disappear from public consciousness, driven back underground, remembered only in whispers, old trip reports, and indigenous ceremonies that continued quietly, far from the chaos the counterculture had left behind. While cities burned and protests raged, a quieter revolution was happening in the deserts, forests, and makeshift communes scattered across America. Young people, disillusioned with capitalism, war, and the nuclear family model, were dropping out, tuning in, and, yes, eating a lot of cactus. Mescaline became the sacrament of the counterculture, a way to chemically divorce yourself from mainstream society and marry the universe instead. Communes sprouted like psychedelic mushrooms across the American landscape. Some lasted decades. Most collapsed within months when people realized that shared ideals don't automatically translate into shared dishwashing duties. But what united nearly all of them was a belief that consciousness itself needed to be liberated, and psychedelics were the key that opened the cage. In New Mexico, Arizona, and Southern California, places where peyote actually grew, communes often incorporated indigenous-inspired ceremonies into their communal life. They'd heard about Native American church rituals, read anthropology books, and maybe talked to someone who knew someone who'd actually participated in a real ceremony. Then they'd create their own versions, which ranged from respectful adaptations to embarrassing appropriations involving feather headdresses and broken Sanskrit. The more serious communes tried to do it right. They'd appoint a guide or facilitator, someone who'd taken mescaline before, and claimed they could handle the responsibility. They'd prepare the space, clean the teepee or yurt or repurposed barn, gather firewood, set up an altar with candles, crystals, and whatever spiritual objects people brought from home. They'd fast beforehand, set intentions, and approach the ceremony with genuine reverence. Then they'd eat the cactus, all together, forming a circle and holding hands like they were summoning something. And in a way, they were. Summoning visions, yes, but also summoning community, connection, and a shared experience of ego dissolution that made hierarchies and petty disagreements feel absurd by comparison. The experience in a communal setting was different from taking mescaline alone or in a clinical environment. When everyone is tripping together, the boundaries between self and other start to blur in ways that feel profound. You look at your fellow commune members and see not just individuals but reflections of yourself, parts of a larger whole. The concept of we're all one stops being a cliché and starts feeling like obvious truth. Music was central. Someone always brought a guitar. Someone else had drums. People sang folk songs, traditional hymns twisted into psychedelic mantras, improvised melodies that followed the rhythm of the fire. The music created a container for the experience, something to hold on to when the visions became overwhelming. a thread to follow back to consensus reality when you'd wandered too far into the cosmic void. But communal mescaline experiences also revealed fractures. When you strip away social conventions and ego defenses, what emerges isn't always beautiful. Long-buried resentments surface. Power dynamics that were politely ignored in daily life become glaringly obvious. That guy who talks too much and never listens. On mescaline, he becomes unbearable, his voice a colonizing force in shared psychic space. The person who's been quietly holding the community together. Suddenly everyone can see their exhaustion, their martyrdom, the anger they've been suppressing. Some communes used mescaline as a kind of group therapy, a way to process conflict and reach deeper understanding. Others found that psychedelics just made conflicts weirder and harder to resolve. Turns out, having a screaming argument about who left the compost bin open is even more surreal when everyone's seeing geometric patterns and questioning the nature of identity. The integration of mescaline into communal life also raised practical problems. How do you maintain a functioning society when half the members are intermittently unable to distinguish between profound spiritual insights and complete nonsense? How do you make decisions when someone claims their vision revealed the true path and wants to redirect everyone's energy toward building a geodesic dome aligned with ley lines? Some communes developed rules. No tripping during harvest season, no important decisions made while under the influence, mandatory integration sessions afterward where people could discuss their experiences without claiming cosmic authority. Other communes descended into chaos, with charismatic leaders using psychedelic experiences to consolidate power, claiming their visions were more valid, more enlightened, more connected to universal truth. And then there was the appropriation issue, which few white commune members thought seriously about. They were using a sacred plant from indigenous traditions, stripping away the cultural context, the songs, the protocols that had developed over millennia, and replacing them with whatever felt right in the moment. They called it spiritual freedom and transcending culture. Indigenous people called it theft. Some Native American church members visited communes, trying to educate these well-meaning but clueless seekers about proper protocols, about respect, about the difference between cultural exchange and cultural exploitation. Some commune members listened. Most didn't, convinced that spirituality was universal and therefore belonged to everyone equally. A convenient belief when you're the one taking things that don't belong to you. By the mid-1970s, as the commune movement began to fragment and collapse, mescaline's role in counterculture life faded. People got older, had kids, needed steady jobs. The ones who stayed committed to alternative lifestyles often moved away from psychedelics entirely, finding spirituality in meditation, yoga, or organic farming instead. But for a brief, intense period, mescaline had been the chemical glue holding together a vision of communal living, shared consciousness, and radical rejection of mainstream values. It didn't build utopia. Turns out drugs alone can't solve the fundamental problems of human nature, but it did create temporary spaces where people glimpsed something different, something that felt like possibility, and some of those people never forgot that glimpse. They carried it forward into activism, art, environmentalism, and spirituality, shaped forever by nights spent around fires in the desert, stomachs churning, visions flowing, believing, if only for a few hours, that another world was possible. In 1971, journalist Hunter S. Thompson published Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, a gonzo masterpiece that reads like a fever dream narrated by someone who lost a fight with every drug ever made. And right there, on page 1, mescaline makes its entrance, not as a sacred medicine or a research chemical, but as part of a mobile drug lab crammed into the trunk of a red convertible, screaming through the Nevada desert. Thompson wasn't interested in spiritual enlightenment or indigenous wisdom. He was interested in chaos, in pushing consciousness to its breaking point, in documenting what happened when you consumed enough substances to kill a small horse and then tried to function in polite society. His approach to mescaline was less sacred ceremony and more recreational demolition derby. The opening scene is legendary. We had 2 bags of grass, 75 pellets of mescaline, 5 sheets of high-powered blotter acid, a salt shaker half full of cocaine, and a whole galaxy of multicolored uppers, downers, screamers, laughers, and also a quart of tequila, a quart of rum, a case of Budweiser, a pint of raw ether, and 24 amyls. It's an inventory that reads like a dare, a challenge to both pharmacology and human endurance. Thompson's narrator, Raoul Duke, approaches mescaline with the reverence of someone using dynamite to open a can of beans. There's no careful set and setting, no spiritual preparation, no intention beyond seeing how far you can bend reality before it snaps. He takes mescaline in casinos, in hotel rooms, in the middle of covering a story about law enforcement and the American dream. The substances aren't sacred, they're ammunition in a war against boredom and conformity. The mescaline scenes in the book are absurd, terrifying, and darkly hilarious. Duke hallucinates reptiles in the casino, other gamblers transformed into lizards, dinosaurs, creatures that shouldn't exist outside of nightmares, or particularly creative evolutionary biology. He becomes paranoid, convinced that hotel staff are conspiring against him, that reality itself is a thin membrane ready to tear at any moment. But Thompson wasn't just writing drug comedy, he was documenting something darker. Fear and Loathing is set in 1971, right as the optimism of the 1960s counterculture was curdling into paranoia and disillusionment. The Vietnam War was still raging. Nixon was in power. The hippie dream of changing the world through love and consciousness expansion had collapsed into violence, bad drugs, and bitter disappointment. Mescaline in Thompson's hands becomes a symbol of that collapse. It's no longer the key to enlightenment. It's just another way to obliterate consciousness, to escape a reality that's become unbearable. The visions aren't profound, they're grotesque. The insights aren't cosmic, they're paranoid. Taking mescaline doesn't expand Duke's mind, it fractures it, leaving him stranded between worlds, unable to function in either. Thompson writes, "We had all the momentum, we were riding the crest of a high and beautiful wave. So now, less than 5 years later, you can go up on a steep hill in Las Vegas and look west, and with the right kind of eyes you can almost see the high water mark, that place where the wave finally broke and rolled back. That's mescaline in 1971. The wave had broken. What had started as sacred ceremony, been studied by scientists, inspired intellectuals, and fueled utopian dreams, had crashed into the harsh desert of American reality and left behind wreckage, confusion, and a lot of very high, very lost people wandering through casinos, wondering why the reptiles were judging them. Thompson's portrayal was influential but deeply misleading. He presented psychedelics as tools for chaos rather than insight, entertainment rather than transformation. Millions of readers encountered mescaline first through his wild, reckless prose and came away thinking it was just another party drug, something you took to lose your mind rather than find something deeper. This did two things. It made psychedelics seem dangerous and frivolous, which helped justify their prohibition, and it obscured the serious, intentional, sacred ways people had been using these substances for millennia. Thompson's version was funny, sure, but it was also reductive, stripping away context and meaning in favor of spectacle. To be fair, Thompson probably didn't care. He wasn't writing anthropology or advocacy, he was writing about the death of the American dream and his own dissolution as both a journalist and a person. Mescaline was just one more tool in his arsenal of self-destruction, documented with brutal honesty and savage humor, but the legacy stuck. For decades after Fear and Loathing, mescaline in popular culture was associated with Thompson's gonzo excess rather than Huxley's philosophical inquiry or the Huickel's sacred pilgrimage. It became a punchline, a reference, a symbol of the 1960s gone wrong. Hunter S. Thompson didn't kill mescaline's reputation, it was already dying. But he wrote its obituary with such style, such dark comedy, such obvious talent that people remembered his version long after they'd forgotten all the others. And in doing so, he helped ensure that when people thought of mescaline, they thought of reptiles in casinos, not ceremonies in deserts or doorways to perception. The cactus deserved better, but literature rarely cares what its subjects deserve. By the early 1970s, the party was officially over, not because people stopped wanting to get high, humans have never stopped wanting that, but because the US government decided that drugs, especially psychedelic ones, were a threat to national security, social order, and Richard Nixon's re-election campaign. In 1970, the Controlled Substances Act was passed, and mescaline, along with LSD, psilocybin, and cannabis, was classified as a Schedule I substance. Schedule I is the government's way of saying this is the worst possible thing that could exist. It's a category reserved for drugs with high potential for abuse, no accepted medical use, and a lack of accepted safety for use under medical supervision. Heroin is Schedule I. So is mescaline, a cactus that indigenous people have used safely and ceremonially for nearly 6,000 years. That's right, according to the US. Government, a plant with millennia of documented ritual use, has no medical value and is as dangerous as drugs that actually kill people in massive numbers. The justification for this classification was political, not scientific. Nixon and his advisors weren't concerned about public health, they were concerned about control. The counterculture movement, with its drugs, protests, and refusal to conform, represented a direct threat to the conservative establishment. Making psychedelics illegal was a way to criminalize dissent, to arrest hippies, activists, and minorities, and to reassert governmental authority. John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy advisor, admitted as much decades later in a shocking interview. "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. That's the war on drugs in a nutshell, a deliberate campaign of misinformation, criminalization, and social control masquerading as public health policy. Mescaline became collateral damage in a war that was never really about drugs at all. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Research into psychedelics, research that had shown promising results for treating alcoholism, depression, and end-of-life anxiety, ground to a halt. Scientists couldn't get funding, universities couldn't get approval, clinical trials were shut down or abandoned. Decades of potential medical advances were sacrificed because the government decided that controlling political dissent was more important than understanding consciousness or treating mental illness. For indigenous communities, the prohibition was especially cruel. The Native American Church had been fighting for decades to protect their religious use of peyote, and now the substance was suddenly Schedule I, technically illegal, even for ceremonial purposes. They had to fight again, filing lawsuits, lobbying Congress, and arguing that their religious freedom was being violated. Eventually, in 1994, Congress passed the American Indian Religious Freedom Act amendments, which provided some protection for peyote use by Native American church members. But it was a narrow exemption, full of restrictions and requirements. You had to be enrolled in a federally recognized tribe. The peyote had to be used in religious ceremonies, not for personal spiritual exploration. And even with legal protection, members faced harassment, arrests, and confiscation of their sacrament by law enforcement who either didn't know about the exemption or didn't care. For everyone else, researchers, spiritual seekers, people interested in consciousness exploration, mescaline became completely inaccessible. Possessing it could land you in prison for years. Manufacturing or distributing it carried even harsher penalties. The substance that Huxley had described as opening the doors of perception was now locked behind bars, both literally and figuratively. The cultural narrative around psychedelics shifted dramatically. What had once been portrayed as tools for expanding consciousness, exploring the mind, and accessing spiritual insights were now drugs of abuse, associated with crime, insanity, and moral corruption. Media stories focused on bad trips, mental breakdowns, and cautionary tales. The idea that psychedelics might have value, therapeutic, spiritual, or philosophical, was dismissed as hippie nonsense, dangerous delusion, or both. And it worked. Public opinion turned sharply against psychedelics. Parents who might have experimented with mescaline in their youth warned their children against all drugs, lumping aspirin and heroin into the same terrifying category. Schools launched drug education programs that were long on scare tactics and short on actual information. Just Say No became a slogan, a bumper sticker, a substitute for nuanced conversation about substances, consciousness, and human curiosity. The war on drugs didn't make drugs disappear. Drug use continued at roughly the same rates throughout the Prohibition era. What it did do was criminalize millions of people, disproportionately targeting black and brown communities, filling prisons, destroying families, and creating a massive carceral system that ruined lives for non-violent drug offenses. Mescaline, already rare and difficult to obtain, essentially vanished from the black market. Why risk manufacturing or selling mescaline when LSD was easier to produce, more potent per dose, and just as illegal? Dealers moved on. Users moved on. And mescaline became a footnote, a substance people had heard of but rarely encountered, remembered more for its role in counterculture mythology than for any lived experience. The war on drugs declared war on consciousness itself, on the human desire to explore altered states, to seek meaning beyond the mundane, to ask questions about the nature of reality. And in doing so, it didn't just criminalize substances, it criminalized curiosity, suppressed research, and guaranteed that generations would be denied access to tools that might have helped them heal, grow, or simply understand themselves better. America chose fear, and mescaline, along with millions of people, paid the price. When mescaline and other psychedelics were criminalized in the 1970s, something devastating happened that had nothing to do with hippies or music festivals. Legitimate scientific research ground to a halt. Universities couldn't get funding, researchers couldn't get approval. Labs that had been studying consciousness, mental health, and the therapeutic potential of these substances were shut down or forced to pivot to less controversial work, like studying lab rats and depression without any creative solutions. Before Prohibition, psychedelic research had been genuinely promising. In the 1950s and 1960s, hundreds of studies explored mescaline, LSD, and psilocybin for treating alcoholism, depression, anxiety, and PTSD. Some of the results were remarkable, success rates that matched or exceeded conventional treatments, often with just a single session. But when Schedule I classification took effect, all of that ended. Schedule I status didn't just make psychedelics illegal for recreational use, it made them nearly impossible to study. To conduct research on a Schedule I substance, you need DEA approval, which requires proving the substance has potential medical value. But you can't prove medical value without conducting research. It's a perfect catch-22, intentionally designed to prevent exactly the kind of scientific inquiry that might challenge the government's classification. The few researchers who tried to continue their work faced bureaucratic nightmares. Obtaining mescaline legally required multiple layers of approval, security protocols that rivaled nuclear facilities, and justifications that satisfied regulators who were often hostile to the entire concept of psychedelic research. Most scientists gave up. It wasn't worth the career risk, the funding uncertainty, or the social stigma. So for nearly 40 years, from the early 1970s until the late 2000s, mescaline research essentially didn't exist. A compound that had fascinated scientists, inspired philosophers, and guided Indigenous ceremonies for millennia was relegated to the dustbin of history, studied only in secret, discussed only in whispers, remembered only by aging hippies and Indigenous practitioners. But here's what's particularly tragic. During those decades, our understanding of the brain advanced exponentially. Neuroimaging technologies like fMRI and PET scans allowed researchers to see inside living brains, to map neural networks, to understand how different regions communicate. New theories of consciousness emerged. The role of serotonin receptors was clarified. The default mode network, a brain system involved in ego, self-referential thinking, and rumination, was discovered and studied. All of these advances would have revolutionized psychedelic research. Imagine if scientists in the 1980s and 1990s could have studied what mescaline actually does in the brain using modern neuroscience. We might understand consciousness differently. We might have treatments for mental illness that actually work. We might know how to use these substances therapeutically, safely, and effectively. Instead, we got decades of silence. Indigenous communities continued their ceremonies, but their knowledge remained oral, localized, and inaccessible to the broader scientific community. The few researchers who maintained interest in psychedelics had to content themselves with theoretical work, literature reviews, and increasingly outdated data from studies conducted before Prohibition. The cost wasn't just scientific, it was human. People suffering from depression, anxiety, PTSD, and addiction were denied access to treatments that might have helped them, all because of a political decision made in 1970 by people who cared more about controlling dissent than alleviating suffering. How many lives could have been improved or saved if psychedelic research had continued? We'll never know, but the number isn't zero. The research freeze also created a knowledge gap that persists today. When psychedelic research finally resumed in the 2000s, and we'll get to that, scientists had to start almost from scratch. The old studies were difficult to replicate. Methodologies had changed. Ethical standards had evolved. And 40 years of potential progress had been lost, erased not by lack of interest but by deliberate governmental suppression. Some researchers, frustrated by Prohibition, moved their work overseas. Countries like Switzerland and the Netherlands allowed limited psychedelic research under strict conditions. But most of the scientific community simply moved on to other topics, abandoning psychedelics to history, myth, and underground experimentation. And in that underground, knowledge deteriorated. Without scientific guidance, without quality control, without standardized dosing or purity testing, people who sought out mescaline or other psychedelics were essentially conducting uncontrolled experiments on themselves. Some had beautiful, transformative experiences, others had terrifying, bad trips. Some took substances that weren't what they thought they were, and there was no one to turn to for help, no research to consult, no experts who could speak publicly without risking their careers. The research freeze turned psychedelics into forbidden knowledge, which made them more dangerous, not less. And it turned the scientific community into accomplices to Prohibition, enforcing silence through fear, careerism, and institutional cowardice. For decades, the lights were out. The labs were empty. The questions went unasked. And mescaline, the molecule that had opened Huxley's doors of perception, sat locked behind Schedule I classification, waiting for someone brave enough, or stubborn enough, to turn the key and let the research begin again. While the rest of America was declaring a war on drugs, indigenous communities were fighting a different battle, the right to practice their religion without being arrested for it. For members of the Native American Church, peyote wasn't a recreational drug, it was a sacrament, as central to their faith as bread and wine are to Christians. But the US government didn't see it that way, at least not at first. The legal battles began almost immediately after the Controlled Substances Act passed in 1970. Federal law technically criminalized all peyote use, which meant that even ceremonial, religious use by Native Americans was illegal. The Native American Church argued that this violated the First Amendment's guarantee of religious freedom. The government countered that drug laws applied to everyone equally, regardless of religious claims. Courts initially sided with the government, establishing a precedent that would haunt religious freedom cases for decades. In 1990, the Supreme Court ruled in Employment Division v. Smith, a case involving two Native American men who were fired from their jobs and denied unemployment benefits after testing positive for mescaline following a peyote ceremony. The court ruled against them, declaring that neutral laws of general applicability, like drug laws, don't violate religious freedom even if they burden religious practices. It was a devastating decision. Justice Antonin Scalia, writing for the majority, essentially said that if the government has a compelling interest, like drug prohibition, it can override religious practices, even those central to a faith tradition. The ruling didn't just affect peyote, it weakened religious freedom protections across the board. But the Native American Church didn't give up. They mobilized politically, lobbying Congress, testifying at hearings, and building coalitions with religious organizations who realized that if peyote wasn't protected, their own practices might not be either. Christians worried about communion wine, Jews worried about ritual circumcision. Everyone suddenly understood that religious freedom is fragile and requires constant defense. In 1993, Congress responded by passing the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, RFRA, which restored stronger protections for religious practices and required the government to demonstrate a compelling interest and use the least restrictive means when burdening religious exercise. Then, in 1994, Congress passed amendments to the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, specifically protecting the use, possession, and transportation of peyote by Native Americans for ceremonial purposes. These laws provided crucial protection, but they came with strings attached. You had to be a member of a federally recognized tribe. The peyote had to be used in bona fide religious ceremonies conducted by the Native American Church. Personal spiritual use, even by Native Americans, wasn't protected. And the laws didn't extend protection to non-native people, even if they participated in genuine ceremonies or practiced peyote religion seriously. This created a bizarre legal situation where the sacredness of peyote was recognized, but only for certain people in certain contexts. It was as if the government said, "Okay, we admit communion wine is sacred for Christians, but only for Catholics, and only if they drink it in specific churches, and only in decided, and definitely not if they're Protestant or just spiritually curious." Enforcement remained inconsistent. Some law enforcement agencies respected the exemption, others didn't, arresting Native American church members, confiscating their peyote, and forcing them to fight criminal charges that shouldn't have been filed in the first place. Legal battles continued throughout the 1990s and 2000s, with Indigenous communities repeatedly having to prove their right to practice their own religion. The battles weren't just legal, they were also ecological and cultural. As demand for peyote increased, both from growing Native American church membership and from non-Indigenous people harvesting illegally, wild peyote populations began to decline. The slow-growing cactus couldn't regenerate fast enough to meet demand. Land development, drought, and climate change made things worse. The Native American Church found itself in a difficult position, defending their sacred plant from prohibition while also trying to protect it from overharvesting and extinction. They established guidelines for sustainable harvesting, educated members about conservation, and worked with landowners in Texas, where most U.S. peyote grows, to protect critical habitat. Some Native American church leaders also began wrestling with a thorny question: should non-native people be allowed to use peyote? On one hand, restricting access based on ethnicity felt wrong, especially for those who genuinely respected the tradition and practiced it seriously. On the other hand, opening peyote use to everyone risked exploitation, appropriation, and ecological devastation. There was no easy answer. Some Indigenous leaders welcomed sincere, non-native practitioners, believing that sacred medicines should be shared with those who approach them respectfully. Others argued that centuries of cultural genocide earned Indigenous communities the right to keep certain practices closed, that some things shouldn't be shared, that saying no to outsiders is an act of sovereignty and self-preservation. These debates continue today. The Native American Church remains one of the largest and most significant Indigenous religious movements in North America, with hundreds of thousands of members. It's adapted, evolved, and survived through legal battles, cultural shifts, and the ongoing challenge of protecting a sacred plant in a world that doesn't understand sacredness. The legal victories were hard-won and remain fragile. Religious freedom isn't something you win once and keep forever. It's something you defend continuously, in courtrooms and in Congress, through activism and through simply practicing your faith, despite those who'd rather you didn't. The Native American Church fought back, and they won. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to ensure that peyote ceremonies still happen, that songs are still sung, that traditions continue. In a century defined by prohibition, criminalization, and the war on drugs, that survival is nothing short of miraculous. After decades of silence, something unexpected happened in the early 2000s. Scientists started talking about psychedelics again, not in whispers at underground conferences, but in peer-reviewed journals, at major universities, and in clinical trials funded by real money. The psychedelic renaissance had begun, and mescaline, while often overshadowed by its louder cousins like psilocybin and MDMA, was part of the conversation. The breakthrough came from a handful of brave, or possibly reckless researchers who decided that the war on drugs couldn't suppress scientific curiosity forever. Rick Doblin founded the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, in 1986, spending decades navigating regulatory bureaucracy to make psychedelic research possible again. Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins began studying psilocybin's effects on consciousness and spirituality. David Nutt in the UK challenged drug classification systems that had no scientific basis. These weren't counterculture activists or hippie holdouts. They were credentialed scientists with institutional backing, methodological rigor, and a willingness to stake their careers on the idea that psychedelics deserved another look. And slowly, painfully, the scientific establishment began to listen. The early studies focused on psilocybin and MDMA rather than mescaline, mostly for practical reasons. Psilocybin could be synthesized relatively easily and had a shorter duration, 4 to 6 hours, versus mescaline's 10, 12, making clinical trials more manageable. MDMA showed remarkable promise for treating PTSD, but the underlying principles applied to all psychedelics. These substances could produce profound psychological effects that, in the right context with proper support, might have therapeutic value. Research findings started accumulating, and they were impressive. Psilocybin helped terminally ill patients confront death with less anxiety. MDMA-assisted therapy showed breakthrough results for PTSD. LSD and psilocybin helped people quit smoking and drinking after years of failed attempts. Depression that had resisted conventional treatment sometimes responded to a single psychedelic session. The mechanism seemed to involve temporarily disrupting the brain's default mode network, the system responsible for self-referential thinking, ego, and habitual patterns of thought. Psychedelics essentially rebooted the brain, allowing people to see their problems from new perspectives, to break out of destructive mental loops, to experience themselves and the world differently. Mescaline research lagged behind, partly because of its longer duration and more intense physical effects, partly because peyote's endangered status made it ethically complicated to use in research, and partly because other psychedelics simply got there first. But a few studies did emerge. Researchers at the Hefter Research Institute, named after Arthur Hefter, the chemist who first isolated mescaline, began exploring its unique properties and potential therapeutic applications. What they found was that mescaline's effects were distinct from other psychedelics in subtle but meaningful ways. Users consistently reported a more earthy quality to the experience, more connection to nature and indigenous wisdom, less of the cold, electric intensity that sometimes characterized LSD. The longer duration allowed for deeper processing, and the physical discomfort, the nausea, the body load, seemed to serve a purpose, creating a kind of purging or cleansing that people found valuable, even as they were suffering through it. Public perception began shifting too. Media coverage of psychedelic research was surprisingly positive. The New York Times, The Atlantic, and other mainstream publications ran articles about scientists studying these substances seriously. Books like Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind became bestsellers, introducing millions of readers to the psychedelic renaissance and arguing that these substances deserved reconsideration. Entrepreneurs saw opportunity. Startups formed to develop psychedelic therapies, raising millions in venture capital. Pharmaceutical companies began investigating whether they could develop patentable variants of psychedelic compounds. The psychedelic industry was being born, complete with conferences, trade shows, and investment pitch decks. But this commercialization worried many people, especially indigenous communities who'd been protecting peyote and other sacred medicines for centuries, while scientists ignored them and governments criminalized them. Now that psychedelics were potentially profitable, suddenly everyone cared. Biotech companies were trying to patent compounds derived from traditional medicines. Wellness retreats were charging thousands of dollars for ceremonies that appropriated indigenous practices, and very little of the money was flowing back to the communities who'd preserved this knowledge. The psychedelic renaissance brought hope that mental health treatment might actually improve, that consciousness research might advance, that the war on drugs might finally end. But it also brought complications, questions about who profits, who gets access, whether medicalization would strip these substances of their spiritual significance, and whether the same mistakes of the 1960s would be repeated. For mescaline specifically, the Renaissance meant renewed interest but also renewed threats. As psychedelic tourism exploded, more people sought out peyote and San Pedro experiences. Retreats in Mexico, Peru, and even the United States offered ceremonies to wealthy Westerners seeking enlightenment or healing. Demand increased, prices rose, and the slow-growing cacti, already threatened by overharvesting and habitat loss, faced new pressure. Scientists also began studying synthetic mescaline as a potential therapeutic tool. If you could produce the compound in a lab, you could avoid depleting wild cactus populations while making the substance available for research and eventually perhaps for treatment. But synthesizing mescaline is complex and expensive compared to other psychedelics, which limited its commercial appeal. Still, the Renaissance was real. After 40 years of prohibition-enforced silence, psychedelics were back in the scientific conversation. Researchers were asking questions again. Universities were approving studies. Funding was available. And slowly, carefully, the knowledge that had been suppressed was being recovered, expanded, and integrated into modern neuroscience and psychiatry. The doors of perception had been forced shut in 1970. Now, in the early 21st century, they were creaking open again, not wide open, not without resistance, but open enough for light to get through. Science was trying again. And this time, hopefully, they'd learned something from the mistakes of the past. Fast forward to the 2010s, and something truly bizarre happened. The same substances that once fueled anti-establishment movements, spiritual awakenings, and government paranoia were now being microdosed by tech CEOs in expensive hoodies who wanted to optimize their productivity and disrupt their consciousness. Mescaline, along with LSD and psilocybin, became part of the Silicon Valley biohacking toolkit, taken in tiny doses meant to enhance focus, creativity, and problem-solving without, actually tripping. Microdosing, taking sub-perceptual doses of psychedelics, usually about 1/10 of a full dose, became the latest trend in a culture obsessed with optimization, performance enhancement, and finding competitive edges. Tech workers, startup founders, and venture capitalists began discreetly dosing themselves every few days, claiming it made them more creative, more productive, more emotionally balanced. The idea wasn't entirely new. Albert Hofmann, the chemist who synthesized LSD, reportedly microdosed well into old age and credited it with maintaining his mental clarity. But Silicon Valley turned microdosing into a movement, complete with dosing protocols, online forums, and anecdotal testimonials that ranged from believable to absolutely absurd. Mescaline microdosing was less common than LSD or psilocybin, mostly because obtaining actual mescaline was difficult, and the compound's longer duration made it less convenient for a workday schedule. But some people preferred it, claiming the experience was gentler, more grounded, more connected to intuition, and less mentally frenetic than LSD microdoses. The typical mescaline microdose was around 30-50 milligrams, compared to the 200 to 400 milligrams used in full ceremonial doses. At this level, users reported subtle effects: enhanced colors, mild mood elevation, increased empathy, and a sense of flow that made creative work feel easier. Some claimed it helped them solve programming problems, generate new business ideas, or connect dots they'd previously missed. But here's where it gets weird. Silicon Valley microdosing had virtually nothing in common with traditional psychedelic use. Indigenous ceremonies emphasized ego dissolution, spiritual connection, and community healing. Huxley and the intellectuals sought expanded consciousness and mystical insight. Even the 1960s counterculture wanted to change society, to reject capitalism and materialism. Silicon Valley wanted the opposite. They wanted to perform better under capitalism, to be more productive, to make more money. They approached psychedelics not as sacred medicines or tools for liberation, but as nootropics, cognitive enhancers, performance drugs, supplements to add to their morning routine alongside coffee, meditation apps, and bulletproof butter coffee. The spiritual was stripped away entirely. Microdosers didn't fast, didn't set intentions, didn't create ceremonial space. They just popped a capsule before their morning stand-up meeting and hoped it would help them ship code faster. The plant that indigenous people had walked 300 miles to harvest with prayers was now being synthesized in labs, encapsulated in gelatin, and used to improve quarterly earnings. Some psychedelic advocates were horrified. This wasn't consciousness expansion, it was consciousness exploitation, turning sacred medicines into productivity hacks for an economic system that was destroying the planet and concentrating wealth in fewer and fewer hands. Using mescaline to write better advertising algorithms or optimize user engagement metrics felt like a betrayal of everything the substance represented. Others argued that any use that reduced suffering or increased well-being was valid, that restricting psychedelics to proper spiritual contexts was gatekeeping, and that if microdosing helped someone with depression or anxiety, who cares if they also used it to be better at their job? The scientific evidence for microdosing remained mixed. Some studies showed benefits. Others suggested the effects were largely placebo. People expected to feel more creative and focused, so they did, regardless of whether they'd actually taken a psychedelic or just lactose powder. The doses were so small that it wasn't clear if they were even pharmacologically active, or if the benefits came from the ritual of taking something, from the mindset shift of believing you'd accessed an enhancement. But evidence didn't matter much to true believers. Microdosing became a status symbol in certain tech circles, a way to signal that you were optimizing not just your work but your consciousness itself. People compared protocols, shared sourcing tips, and debated whether morning or afternoon dosing was superior with the same intensity they brought to programming languages or startup strategies. The trend also highlighted class dynamics. Poor people who used drugs to cope with their circumstances were criminalized, arrested, labeled addicts. Rich tech workers who used drugs to enhance performance were pioneers, biohackers, consciousness explorers. The substance and the dose didn't determine how society responded. The user's tax bracket did. And then there was the appropriation issue, again. Mescaline came from indigenous practices, was protected through centuries of oppression, and now wealthy, predominantly white tech workers were using it as a performance enhancer without acknowledgement, respect, or compensation to the cultures who'd preserved it. They'd stripped away the context, the ceremony, the meaning, and kept only the chemical effect. Some indigenous leaders spoke out, pointing out that microdosing was the latest form of colonization, taking what belonged to indigenous people, repackaging it for capitalist purposes, and erasing the original context entirely. But their voices were often drowned out by the hype, the testimonials, and the relentless optimism of people convinced they'd discovered a life hack for consciousness. Silicon Valley microdosing represented everything that could go wrong when sacred medicines enter mainstream culture without proper context, respect, or understanding. It wasn't necessarily harmful, some people probably did benefit, but it was fundamentally disconnected from the traditions, the wisdom, and the spiritual frameworks that had made these substances meaningful in the first place. Mescaline had gone from sacred teacher to research chemical to prohibited substance to productivity supplement. The journey was almost complete. And whether that represented progress, tragedy, or just the inevitable commodification of everything under capitalism was a question no microdose could answer. Here's an uncomfortable truth that doesn't fit neatly into psychedelic manifestos or corporate wellness seminars. We're running out of peyote. The same sacred cactus that has sustained indigenous ceremonies for thousands of years is now endangered, and the reason is painfully predictable: overharvesting, habitat destruction, and a sudden surge in demand from people who have absolutely no connection to its traditional use. Peyote grows slowly, excruciatingly slowly. A cactus needs 10-30 years to reach maturity, to grow large enough to contain sufficient mescaline for ceremonial use. In that time, it survives droughts, extreme temperatures, and grazing animals. It's a survivor, adapted to one of the harshest environments on Earth, but it's not adapted to humans showing up with shovels and harvesting buttons by the thousands. The cactus only grows naturally in a small region, parts of the Chihuahuan Desert in southern Texas and northern Mexico. That habitat is shrinking. And land development, agriculture, oil and gas extraction, and border wall construction have destroyed huge swaths of peyote habitat. Climate change is making droughts longer and more severe, and the remaining populations are being harvested faster than they can regenerate. Indigenous communities, particularly the Native American Church, have tried to harvest sustainably. Traditional practices involve cutting only the crown of the cactus, leaving the root intact so it can produce new buttons. When done carefully, one plant can be harvested multiple times over its lifetime. But even sustainable harvesting has limits when demand exceeds the cactus's ability to reproduce. And demand has exploded. Native American Church membership has grown significantly, currently estimated at 250,000 to 400,000 members, all of whom need peyote for ceremonies. As membership increased and ceremonies became more frequent, the pressure on wild populations intensified. Then came the psychedelic renaissance. Suddenly, people who'd never heard of peyote were curious. Researchers wanted samples, wellness retreats needed inventory, and underground markets found new customers. Some people, frustrated by legal restrictions, began harvesting their own, often destructively, pulling up entire plants rather than carefully cutting crowns. Others turned to poaching, trespassing on private land in Texas where most U.S. peyote grows. Texas has only about 6 licensed peyote harvesters, peyoteros, who legally supply the Native American Church. They harvest from private ranches under agreements with landowners. But even licensed harvesting couldn't keep up with demand. Wait times for peyote orders stretched to months, then years. Prices increased. And some Native American Church members, unable to get peyote legally, turned to illegal sources or went without, missing ceremonies they'd relied on for spiritual and emotional support. Scientists studying peyote populations began raising alarms. Field surveys showed declining numbers, fewer young plants, and increasing distances between surviving cacti, a sign that populations were fragmenting and struggling to reproduce. Some areas that once supported thriving peyote communities now had none, the land scraped clean by overharvesting. Conservation organizations began working with indigenous communities, landowners, and scientists to develop solutions. Some landowners agreed to protect peyote habitat on their property. Botanists started studying peyote cultivation, trying to figure out if the cactus could be grown commercially to take pressure off wild populations. The Native American Church launched education campaigns, encouraging members to use peyote sparingly and to support conservation efforts. But cultivation proved difficult. Peyote grows slowly even in ideal conditions. Commercial cultivation required decades of investment before producing harvestable buttons. And there were spiritual concerns. Many Native American Church members believed that peyote needed to come from its native habitat, that cultivated buttons lacked the spiritual potency of wild ones, that something essential was lost when you grew the sacred plant in greenhouses like tomatoes. Meanwhile, San Pedro, another mescaline-containing cactus, was being harvested in Peru and Ecuador, where it grows in the Andes and is used in traditional curanderismo practices. San Pedro grows faster than peyote, reaching harvestable size in 3 to 7 years, which made it more sustainable. Psychedelic retreats increasingly offered San Pedro ceremonies instead of peyote, and some Native American church groups began incorporating it as well. But San Pedro wasn't a perfect substitute. It contains lower concentrations of mescaline requiring larger doses. The taste, if anything, was even worse. And for communities with specific traditions around peyote, switching to San Pedro meant abandoning practices that had been maintained for generations. The sustainability crisis forced uncomfortable conversations. Should access to peyote be restricted to protect the species, even if that meant limiting religious freedom? Should non-Indigenous people be prohibited from using peyote entirely? Should synthetic mescaline replace natural buttons? How do you balance conservation with sacred tradition? Some Indigenous leaders argued that non-native use should be banned completely, that centuries of protection earned them the right to exclusive access, and that opening peyote to everyone guaranteed its extinction. Others felt that sharing the medicine responsibly was part of its purpose, that limiting access based on ethnicity was wrong, and that education, rather than prohibition, was the answer. There was no consensus, no easy solution. The cactus that had survived Spanish conquest, Catholic persecution, and federal prohibition was now threatened by its own popularity, by the psychedelic renaissance it had helped inspire, by the very desire to experience what Indigenous people had been protecting all along. The lesson was harsh but clear. You can't scale sacred medicine. You can't meet infinite demand from a slow-growing desert cactus. You can't reconcile capitalism's hunger for resources with ecosystems that operate on geological timescales. And you can't preserve tradition while simultaneously making it accessible to everyone who's curious. We were running out of cactus, and if something didn't change, future generations might only know peyote through stories, museum specimens, and empty desert landscapes where a sacred plant once grew. So tonight, as you settle into your bed with its memory foam mattress, climate-controlled room, and easy access to therapy, prescription medication, and a society that at least pretends mental health matters, take a moment to think about the journey we've just traced. 6,000 years. 6,000 years of humans seeking something beyond the ordinary, beyond the mundane weight of survival and suffering, beyond the narrow slice of consciousness we mistake for the whole of reality. Mescaline didn't ask to become what it became. It was just a cactus, growing slowly in an unforgiving desert, minding its own botanical business. Then humans discovered it, and everything changed. Indigenous people turned it into ceremony, into connection, into a doorway between worlds. Spanish conquistadors tried to destroy it and failed. Scientists isolated it, named it, tried to reduce it to chemistry. The counterculture embraced it, governments criminalized it, and now here we are, at the beginning of the 21st century, still arguing about what it means and who gets to decide. But here's what strikes me most about this story. Through all of it, through conquest and prohibition, through laboratory analysis and Silicon Valley microdosing, through medicalization and commodification, the plant itself remained unchanged. Peyote still grows in the same desert, still takes decades to mature, still tastes absolutely terrible, and still produces the same visions it did when someone first ate it thousands of years ago. We changed. The cactus just kept being a cactus. The Haikal are still walking those 300 miles. The Native American church is still holding ceremonies, still singing the songs, still protecting traditions that governments tried to erase. Scientists are finally, after 40 years of enforced silence, asking questions again. And somewhere, right now, someone is probably having their first mescaline experience. Maybe in a ceremony, maybe in a clinical trial, maybe alone in their apartment with a San Pedro cactus they ordered online and a prayer that they did the extraction correctly. What have we learned? That consciousness is stranger and more flexible than we usually admit. That the line between medicine and sacrament isn't as clear as we pretend. That prohibition doesn't work but keeps happening anyway because control matters more to governments than evidence. That indigenous wisdom about plants and healing wasn't primitive superstition. It was sophisticated knowledge that Western science is only now beginning to understand and respect. We've learned that you can't separate a substance from its context. Mescaline in a laboratory is not mescaline in a ceremony, is not mescaline at a music festival, is not mescaline in a therapist's office. Same molecule, completely different meanings. And we've learned, painfully, that sacred things don't survive commodification intact, that when you turn spiritual practices into products, something essential is lost, even if the chemistry remains the same. But maybe the most important lesson is about resilience. Mescaline survived because people, mostly indigenous people, mostly people who had every reason to give up, refused to let it die. They protected it through centuries, when protecting it meant risking everything. They kept the songs alive when singing them was illegal. They maintained the ceremonies, when ceremonies could get you killed. They remembered when remembering was an act of resistance. That's not a story about a drug. That's a story about humans refusing to surrender the sacred, about communities protecting what matters despite overwhelming pressure to assimilate, about the stubborn insistence that consciousness is worth exploring and some experiences are worth suffering for. It's a story about slow-growing desert plants and the even slower work of preserving wisdom across generations. It's about the distance between laboratory and ceremony, between appropriation and appreciation, between using something and honoring it. And it's unfinished. Right now, wild peyote populations are declining. Indigenous communities are fighting to protect their traditions, while also facing pressure to share them. Scientists are discovering therapeutic potential, while pharmaceutical companies calculate profit margins. Seekers are finding healing while sometimes missing the point entirely. The future is being written, and we don't yet know how the next chapter goes. But here's what I hope. I hope we learn to hold multiple truths at once, that mescaline can be studied and sacred, that access can expand while traditions remain protected, that science and ceremony can inform each other rather than compete. I hope we remember that 6,000 years of indigenous use deserves more respect than 6 minutes of Google research and a credit card. I hope we understand that not everything should be available to everyone immediately just because we want it, that some things require preparation, context, humility, and patience. I hope we figure out how to heal both individual minds and collective wounds, how to expand consciousness without destroying ecosystems, how to honor the past while building better futures. I hope the cactus survives. I hope the traditions survive. I hope we become worthy of the gifts these plants offer, the doors they open, the truths they reveal. Because in the end, mescaline is just a molecule. It's what we do with it that matters, how we approach it, what we learn from it, whether we treat it as commodity or sacrament, whether we take without giving back, or enter into relationship with humility and respect. The cactus is still growing in the desert, slow and patient, older than empires, wiser than prohibition. It survived the Spanish. It survived the Inquisition. It survived the war on drugs. It will probably survive us too. The question is whether we'll survive ourselves, whether we can learn from 6,000 years of history, whether we can do better than conquest and prohibition and appropriation, whether we can finally approach the sacred with the respect it's always deserved. So as you drift off tonight, safe and warm and probably never going to eat peyote because honestly, the taste alone is enough to reconsider all your life choices. Maybe just appreciate the mystery. Appreciate that consciousness is vast and strange. Appreciate the indigenous people who protected this knowledge when the rest of the world wanted it dead. Appreciate that some questions don't have easy answers, and some doorways, once opened, can never fully close. Sweet dreams. May your sleep be deep, your visions peaceful, and your respect for slow-growing desert cacti appropriately profound. Because history may be long and complicated and occasionally absurd, but it's also proof that humans have always wanted more meaning, more connection, more truth than ordinary life provides. And sometimes, just sometimes, we find it in the least likely places, bitter buttons growing in hostile deserts, waiting patiently for someone brave enough or foolish enough to taste them and see what happens next. Good night, sleep well, and remember, some journeys take 300 miles on foot, others take 10 hours in your living room. But the destination, that glimpse of something greater than yourself, that's been the same for 6,000 years, and it's not going anywhere. And